Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Asia Society Policy Institute's program on the implications of the escalating U.S. Iran conflict. I'm Deborah Eisenman, Executive Vice President and COO at the Asia Society and Founding Director and Senior Fellow of the Asia Society Policy Institute. It's Tuesday, March 3rd, and we're convening today following a highly consequential weekend in international affairs. 2 days after the latest round of U.S.-Iran nuclear negotiations in Geneva concluded without agreement, the U.S. and Israel launched on Saturday a military offensive against Iran, killing the supreme leader. In the past 3 days, the situation has escalated and the conflict widened, with Iran's retaliatory strikes targeting Israel and U.S. positions in the region and effectively closing the Strait of Hormuz. These developments raise urgent questions about regional stability, economic and energy markets, and the risks of further escalation. To help us unpack these developments and their implications, we're joined today by two experts on the Middle East and Iran, both of whom also serve as Asia Society trustees. We're delighted to have with us Vali Nasr, Professor of International Affairs and Middle East Studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Vali has held several distinguished positions in academia and served as a senior advisor to the U.S. State Department on relations with the Middle East and South Asia. He's also written numerous books, including on Iran's grand strategy, the sanctions regime, and how it affected the country, and on democracy in Iran. Joining Vali in conversation is Hamid Biglari, partner at RedBird Capital Partners, executive chairman of RedBird X, and chairman of financial services. Hamid has a distinguished and diverse 30-year career in financial services, including senior executive roles at Point72 Asset Management and Citigroup. Now, without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Hamid.
Let me preface our conversation by saying that moments like this create a temptation towards false precision, to speak as though one can forecast exactly where this goes. We're not going to even attempt that this morning. Anyone who's studied history knows that wars are simply too dynamic to be predictable. They tend to evolve through a set of incentives, miscalculations, escalation thresholds, domestic political pressures, and all of those variables feed on each other. So rather than pretend that we can predict the next headline, the way I'd like to structure our conversations this morning is around incentives and constraints. So what is each actor trying to achieve? What limits them? What would cause this conflict to widen or narrow? What does a realistic end state look like? So my hope is that if we stay probabilistic and disciplined, we can understand the structure of this conflict without falling into the illusion of certainty. So, Vali, what I would propose is that we start by dissecting what each actor is trying to achieve and what limits their freedom of action. Let me start by taking a stab at that and then ask you to share your perspectives, and then we can discuss it. So the main four actors are the United States, Israel, Iran, and the Gulf states. So let's take them each one by one. For the U.S., my sense is that the primary motivation, although they've been conflicting messaging, my sense is that the primary motivation is restoring deterrence and preventing Iran from becoming a regional threat on both missile and nuclear capacity. But there's also a credibility component, which is to signal that there are certain red lines that will be enforced, such as safe maritime passage through the Strait of Hormuz. The risk, I think, is goal expansion, sliding from deterrence to regime change without an ability to control or own the consequences. As you know, regime change requires internal elite fragmentation. It requires sustained political realignment. It requires effectively an institutional breakdown inside Iran. Outcomes that external military force historically have never been able to achieve. And the United States obviously is constrained by three things: One is domestic political tolerance for an extended war. Second is oil price sensitivity that impacts inflation. And third is America's global bandwidth, particularly given its interest in East Asia, as well as back in the Americas, notably Venezuela and Cuba. So the strategic test for Washington is alignment between military means and bounded political objectives. Israel is different. I think Israel views Iran as a long-term existential threat. It's Iran's missile architecture and nuclear threshold capacity are seen not in an abstract way. It's not an abstract geopolitical risk. It's a direct danger. So Israel's objective, I think, is the long-term degradation of Iran's capacity to threaten it. It's less constrained than Washington by global bandwidth, but it's more constrained by geography because it is within missile range and can tolerate, prolonged erosion of its deterrence. Now, what is interesting, I think, here is that its interests are not identical to Washington's. Israel can tolerate a higher escalation risk in pursuit of a permanent threat reduction in a different way than the United States. For Iran, I think the core objective is regime survival. Everything else is secondary. When it retaliates, its goals are to demonstrate its resilience, to preserve its deterrence capability, and prevent internal elite fracture. I think it faces a delicate balancing act. On the one hand, it needs to impose costs to preserve its deterrence. But on the other hand, it needs to avoid the kind of escalation that could threaten regime continuity. So I think Iran is less concerned with quote unquote winning than with not appearing weak as a path to survival. Finally, I think the Gulf states, what matters to them most is stability. They want Iran to be constrained, but I don't think they want Iran to collapse. I think they fear spillover. They fear energy disruption. They fear domestic instability more than they fear a weakened but coherent Iranian state. Now, if Iran's attacks persist, I think they will strengthen their defensive coordination with Washington while privately or quietly pushing for de-escalation. And that seems to be what one hears in the background. So the motivation of these set of actors, there's some overlap. They're not identical. And that misalignment is often what determines how this conflict could widen or narrow. Let me stop there and ask you for your views.
Thank you. And thanks to Asia Society for putting this together. I agree with you on Israel. I think, if anything, Israel is the actor here whose objectives are most clear. It's been talking about these objectives for a while. There's a consensus in Israel across the political spectrum about these objectives, which you laid out. And it sees an opportunity since the collapse of Hezbollah, since the 12-day war, with the domestic situation in Iran being very fraught, to essentially take Iran out of the region as an actor. I think it's more than just Iran being a threat to Israel. It's to sort of degrade Iran politically, even as a state, and then to basically take its military capabilities away. I think previously the focus was mostly on proxies and the nuclear, but one of the outcomes of the 12-day war in June was that actually Israel discovered a whole new threat in Iran, which was its missile capability, which was it was not successful in destroying, and it did do damage to Israel. So I think that's a very big objective here. On the United States, I'm much more cynical than you. that in the sense that I don't think there is an objective here. I don't think we can actually talk about the United States in the sense that we have before, that there's a national interest that's articulated, that is shared across the U.S. government, that has been socialized with the American people, that particularly given the timing of this. I mean, the president thought that Iran's nuclear program is destroyed. He was totally disinterested in engaging Iran until there were protests in Iran. Then the objective became regime change. Then the objective became nuclear again. And there is no sense of why this war at the scale that it is actually was urgent. What was the urgent threat that it had to happen now? I mean, for all practical purposes, the goals that you said were in place. Iran was in its cage, was facing the fury of its own population. Sanctions were working. The US could just have tightened the screws there. So it's really a war of choice, not by a country, but it's a war of choice by one man. And I think where we go from here on is really also his personal calculation that will be at play. With Iran, I think, the sense in Iran that is that the way they survived the 12-day war, but after that, they were in a box, if you would. In other words, there was no scenario in which the U.S. was willing to even talk to them to lift sanctions. They were biting. They infuriated the population. They ignited the protests that became truly regime threatening and did enormous amount of damage to the state and its credibility and its relation with society. And its defenses against Israel and the United States were still extremely weak, and the shadow of war hung over the country. And they also discovered in the negotiation in Geneva that the US will actually is not really interested in a deal. It's playing with them. A 2-hour meeting before they go to talk about Ukraine and Russia with being unprepared. And then, the Omani foreign minister lifted the veil about, how disinterested the U.S. was in any result in the deal. And the U.S. was not really offering anything to Iran at all in Geneva, other than if Iran completely disarmed and surrendered, or as Steve Witkoff called it, capitulated, the U.S. would not add any new sanctions. And even that you couldn't trust, that Trump would abide even by that. So the Iranians are not interested in going back to the same place. In other words, the war finishes and essentially they're in the same place they were in June. I think their view is that this is the last war. Either they will completely go down, or that they will change Washington and Israel's calculation, particularly Washington's calculation. And the most important factor here for them, I think, is President Trump's threshold for pain. I think they believe he's miscalculated, that this is going to be like Venezuela or like Iran in June, that this is going to be a quick in and out war, no American casualties, no impact on global economy. And the Iranians, they want to disabuse them of that. And so they are gradually escalating. I don't think they see themselves at war with the Gulf states. They see themselves as choking the global economy. So, if you shut down LNG in Qatar, it impacts Europe. If you are, you have created this shadow of risk over the Gulf, it's going to impact varieties of aspects of the global economy. And I think they're only escalating gradually. I don't think we've seen the full force of Iranian attacks, and whether against the U.S. or against Israel, because I think the difference in strategy for the U.S. and Israel, particularly for the U.S., is that this is a boxing match. They want to knock Iran out in first round or second round. The biggest impact comes day one. Kill the supreme leader, kill military commanders, hit as many missile launchers as you can, hit all the targets. Iran is trying to fight a 15-round bout. And he calculates the longer this goes on, the more Israel and the US would be exhausted. I mean, one of their calculations is that they are using their missiles and drones in a way that would deplete the US and Israel, and particularly the Gulf's air defense systems. And I think with the Gulf, they are already running out of interceptors, and they have to compete with Israel and US itself about being resupplied, and there isn't enough resupply. And the Pentagon is worried that the longer the war goes on, It's going to create global shortages for THAAD missiles and interceptors. And so this is a very sort of a calculated strategy by Iran. And I think the Gulf states are between a stone and a hard place. If they actually really side with the U.S. and enter this war, first of all, I think at that point the Houthis will break their ceasefire and enter the war as well, and this will become a much greater threat to them. Secondly, then they have to hope that the regime in Iran changes, because any scenario other than that means that the shadow of the risk that's been created in the past several days is not going to be lifted from the Gulf. In other words, not once, as it's reported, Amazon's cloud services, AWS data centers has been hit. It's going to be a question mark who's going to build data centers within the range of Shahed suicide drones. And I don't think the Gulf actually has a confidence that the US can take care of this problem. And so they are, as Hamid said, are threading, as you said, are threading a very narrow needle of trying to not get involved in the war directly and yet try to make it go away quickly. But I think the problem is not that the US doesn't want ceasefire. I don't think the Iranians actually think the war stopping at this point is to their advantage, because I don't think they also want to establish deterrence against the US. And I don't think there has been enough, I think, damage to the global economy or damage to US interest, facilities, et cetera, done yet to actually for them to think that, okay, they're absorbing all of this. And the way that they survive is basically to come out on the other side with a changed calculation with the US. It's a very risky bet because they may very well fail at it. I don't want to say it's a winning bet, but it's a bet that a desperate person makes. And that's why it makes it very, very dangerous, because, these leaders in Iran, I mean, they could be all killed any minute. It's a battle of survival for them. They're not going to be able to survive in the situation that ended up in June. And so they're trying to shoot their way out of the corner that they're in. And so they're going to shoot at everybody and anybody. And I think the danger for the global system, economic system, is actually, we haven't seen the worst of it. Hopefully not, but I worry that we haven't seen the worst of it.
Well, I think we've framed all of the different variables in our respective views. Let's pick some of these and explore them, double click on some of them to explore them further. You mentioned the decapitation strategy that is being pursued. I think that's one of the most remarkable aspects of both this attack and the 12-day war last June, which is Israel's willingness to pursue leadership decapitation. I don't think we've seen it in quite the same way in conflicts being executed like this. Now, leadership decapitation, Vali, has had a mixed historical record. It can lead to regime collapse, or at least weaken regimes, but just as equally, it can strengthen them depending on how decentralized the nodes of leadership are. And the question is, how many of those nodes can you take out in order to cause collapse? So when the supreme leader, which is quite remarkable, was removed from a centralized political system, and I mean centralized in terms of authority, not in terms of execution. Iran is very decentralized from an execution point of view. But when you remove that, does that fracture elite cohesion in your view, or does it push security institutions to close rank? How do you see that dynamic unfolding?
I mean, I think if he had died of a natural death, or there had been an assassination of just killing him without a war, I think it was possible to open up a debate in Iran. Okay, now that he's gone, and Iran's foreign policy has been largely his imprint, he's never wavered from these positions that he's taken, can we go in a different direction? But I think, first of all, that after the June attack, which killed 30 Revolutionary Guard commanders and was also started with the decapitation, he further decentralized an already decentralized system. I mean, even in June 2025, as you know, Iran survived the war and its military was able to engage Israel right away. I don't think there's any other military in the world that if you killed 30 of its top commanders, that it would be able to sort of engage in war right away and wouldn't collapse. And so they already had built this decentralized system. So it's working. In other words, the supreme leader was removed. The system is working. I think the key issue which you raise about authority becomes much more material when there is, let's say, a consideration of ceasefire on the table, or a consideration of a major turning point in this war. Or let's say the war stops and then they have to make big decisions about the next step. I think then, because they don't have that singular authority with 36 years of leadership who has appointed most of these people, in other words, they're his people, that you're going to see a divergence of view. But there's also, from what I hear, there's also a sense that, right now they're all in it together. Any one of them can be killed at any moment. And nobody in Iran thinks that they have survived out of good offices of Israel or the United States. The assumption is that they all could be killed, and ultimately there is a sort of a cohesion there that comes from that sense that they're all in the same bunker together, and I think the operational level of the state and the military has been delegated way down. So this means that state collapse requires much longer bombing and war and much deeper decapitation before it collapses. I mean, for instance, speaking to someone in Tehran, he said that Israel is systematically hitting all police stations and Revolutionary Guard and security force buildings across Tehran, but there is nobody in them already. I mean, in other words, they're hitting empty buildings, which is doing a lot of damage to neighborhoods, but they're not killing many Revolutionary Guard commanders, or they're not really disrupting. They have already taken their operational capabilities, command and control centers, etc., out of there. Now, to me, this means that, and I'm sure Israelis are probably more aware of it, but I suspect the White House didn't think this through, that this requires a much longer war. And it's not like a quick in and out that maybe Washington thought about. And at the end of the day, let's say in 2 weeks, there is a scenario, and I would say, let's say at least more than 50% chance that the Islamic Republic in some form will be standing, is still be there. And the scenario of a state collapse requires, much longer engagement. So, and I think Khamenei in some ways was successful here. I mean, the very fact that he could be killed and nothing changed. There's no significant disruption in what Iran is doing is indication that you're dealing with a completely different beast. In other words, other states, Venezuela, Arab countries that, the United States has embassies in, businessmen, financiers visit. This is not Iran, in a way. It's not dependent on one man. And it's even different from pre-revolution in Iran, which was highly dependent on one man. And you and I know, I mean, part of it collapsed because that one man couldn't make decisions at the end. And then the system was paralyzed. This is exactly the opposite.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying about a perception among the revolutionary or the Islamic Republic leaders that we're all in this together. Having said that, you and I both know that Iran is not monolithic. There's a spectrum of opinion even within the fabric of this leadership. There are some who are deeply ideological and intransigent, and Khamenei was a clear example of that. And there are those that within the fabric of that system are more pragmatic in terms of their orientation. And I would suggest that, Lajevardi and Vali would be illustrations of a more pragmatic approach. Although they all believe in the same system, there's a spectrum in terms of their willingness to compromise. And it's possible that a decapitation strategy would focus, knowing that you can't take out everyone, it is possible that a decapitation strategy would focus on those who are more intransigent and ideologically unmovable, to make room for those that potentially the United States and Israel could deal with, or allow for space for there to be a greater degree of adjustment within the leadership structure. What's your view on that?
No, I think your point is very well taken, because I think at the end of the day, a lot of these people don't think like the way we characterize them, that they're only regime people. I mean, they also see themselves as patriots defending Iran, et cetera, and the survival of the country, survival of the revolution, et cetera, matters to them. And even if they have an ideological bend, at some point they may come to the conclusion that the path that Khamenei laid out, which has led to this war, is not going anywhere. I mean, after all, this path has gotten into a war. They have to fight it. But then once the war is over, there is an opportunity to have a major rethink. I think it's contingent on two things. One is that how does this war end? Who's standing still, whether Larijani or Ghalibaf are still there. They haven't been assassinated. They haven't been decapitated as well. And also there is, at least within the guards, every decapitation has brought a more radical general to power. In fact, the irony is that the more pragmatic ones have been replaced. The one that the new commander of the Revolutionary Guard is far more hardline ideological than the one that was killed in the Supreme Leader's office. So it depends on who's standing at the end of the day and how does Iran end the war. But I think there is a card to be played by the United States. In other words, the question is, what does the U.S. do to influence that debate in Iran? And I'm not saying there's an easy answer. But if we sort of looked at the example of Hezbollah, you killed all the leadership. They're under enormous amount of pressure to disarm and move forward. And in fact, there are many rumors that actually their current leader is more favorable to integrating into a Lebanese structure than some of the fighters are. But the U.S. has not managed this in a way that actually lays a path that there are incentives for Hezbollah to make the right decision. Yes, I know the Iranian influence is there, but nevertheless, there's no offer for them on the table, political, economic, security in particular, that would actually change the calculation in the mind of the organization. So the U.S. has to have a plan for what you're saying. In other words, there has to be a very clear sense of how you deal with Iran when the ceasefire comes, when the war ends. What is the U.S.'s conception of a longer-term ceasefire peace with Iran, and what is it that these leaders in Iran will be debating over? What they will be debating over could be largely decided by what the United States says and does. I don't want to say that we're not a player, because end of the day, Iran's not going to win this war. Iran will have to pick up the pieces. But so in other words, the United States can dictate the peace, and it has to think beyond, no missiles, no nukes, etc. How will it actually help the next leadership see stability and a future with Iran in a deal with the United States?
Now, let me pick up on another point that you made, which is that it is not, the regime doesn't see its interests as stopping the war now, that it still has some ways to go for it to achieve its objectives. So let me double click on Iran's escalation ladder, because as I think we would both agree, while the regime has been homicidal, it's not irrational when it comes to its own survival. It has a strategy that it's executing. My sense, Vali, is that their strategy is asymmetric and calibrated. They're trying to, first of all, impose costs that escalate in some calibrated way. They're testing their defensive systems, whatever is left of them. They're trying to apply economic pressure, and the biggest economic pressure, obviously, is by attacking energy assets in the Gulf. They're trying to demonstrate their resilience in the manner that you described, which is you can keep decapitating us, but we've built a resilient system. We're not going away. But at the same time, as they're escalating, they need to avoid mass casualty on the opposite side that doesn't unify the opposition, the Arab states, into a broad coalition against them. So there's a balancing act. An escalation is a tool, but really survival is their objective. So my question is, how does the regime impose those costs without triggering overwhelming retaliation and go past a point of no return in terms of the response that it gets?
My sense, and for a long time, I thought that, that was the way that they were calibrating. But I think, and particularly, as I say, with now the more radical commanders and the more that are taking over, I think perhaps the danger is that they might be seeing it differently. First of all, whether England, France, the Arab states want to join in the fight doesn't really make a difference to Iran, because Israel and the United States have more than enough firepower to hit. There's no shortage of airplanes and sorties. So they're not worried that, they will be, that if Saudi, jet fighters or UAE jet fighters were going to join in. So I don't think they calculate that actually their situation can get more difficult if these countries joined in. And I think they've written off the idea that they need to protect these relationships. I mean, even in June, I was actually astounded after the June war that to learn that there was a very strong view, particularly within certain segments of the Revolutionary Guard and the political and intellectual class that supports them and has relationship with them, that said that the normalization that Iran had done with Saudi Arabia had no benefits for Iran. It had provided Saudi Arabia with security, but it had not given Iran security. And if Iran's after security, it should not have any consideration for that relationship. So if Iran's security demands hitting Saudi oil facilities, knocking them out for a number of months, there is no. They argue there is no value in our relationship with Saudi Arabia to consider here. In other words, they're actually looking at the reality that the Gulf states are ultimately, despite all the niceties, embassies, allies of the United States. UAE is also an ally of Israel. End of the day, they're not going to side with Iran. And also, their neutrality or friendship doesn't bring Iran anything, not in a moment of survival. In a moment of peace, yes, there are economic benefits, but not in a moment of survival. So I think that decision, looking at what they're doing to UAE, Saudi, et cetera, I think they've made that decision that they're not going to look at relations with anybody other than Oman and to some extent Qatar as actually anything that would hold them back going after the facilities in these countries. So it's not personal to them. I mean, when they hit LNG terminal in Qatar, it's about crippling Europe and pushing up the price of natural gas. It's not about Qatar. They don't see it this as about Qatar. And also they want to sort of create an understanding that you cannot have, as Ehud Barak once said, a villa in the middle of the jungle. That you could wage war on Iran while the Gulf goes happily about its global business, and that energy prices stay stable. So energy price stability and Gulf security so that business can occur in the Gulf requires no attacking Iran. And I think I have to say, they have been saying that they're going to attack the Gulf steadily to the Gulf leaders. As for them, it's no surprise that this is the strategy. The other side of it is, interestingly, they are exposing the fact that the United States actually cannot protect them, and it's not its priority to protect them. So the U.S. basically took the aircraft carrier Ford to Haifa, essentially assuming that it needs to protect Israel, and it's the corridor between Iran and Israel that needs defending, but it's not actually really defending the Gulf states. And the bases, in a way, are now a liability, if you would, in an instance of war, because they're not able to protect the Gulf, but the Gulf is being hit because of them. And in fact, you're already seeing a lot of sort of Gulf intellectuals, et cetera, Arab intellectuals are saying that, your bases are here. They're here supposedly to defend us, but you're not defending us. You've started a war for which we are paying the price. And all of this is sort of is exactly for Iran's playbook, because, in a way, it's adding layers of complexity for President Trump that he hadn't thought about. In fact, yesterday he said he was surprised. The thing that surprised them with this war was the attack on the Arab countries. And the United States military and the United States statesmen, diplomats may be much more savvy and capable of dealing with this. But Iran ultimately has an audience of one here, just like all other world powers have an audience of one, which is to make this look nastier and messier, and particularly put their finger on something that he understands, which is business and oil prices. And again, they are making an extremely risky bet. I don't want to say this is a good strategy. I'm just saying that I think it is their strategy. And therefore, if we're going to deal with it, we have to sort of look at the way they're doing it and not assume that there's any hindrances, caveats, any reluctance here to go even beyond what they've done right now.
Yeah, and as we're speaking, the markets opened down about 1.5%, 1.6%, as a result of the events yesterday. To your point about ratcheting up economic pain. So let's shift to the United States. In your observations, you noted that, or essentially implied, that the United States has incoherent objectives. I described what I thought should be its strategic objectives, and I think your point was that whether that's true or not, they certainly don't message clearly what their objective is, and they may be, they may not be sure what they're trying to achieve. So that has implications in terms of whether Washington can absorb calibrated retaliation without expanding its objectives. You typically need at least two disciplines to manage a conflict. One is rhetorical discipline. So if the public framing, for example, becomes regime change, as it started out before the administration shifted, Iran's incentives would shift towards maximal resistance. The other dimension of discipline is operational discipline. So protecting the Gulf bases, maritime flows is the center of gravity. And if Iran's retaliation becomes economically very disruptive, I think there's a very high likelihood that Washington will need to expand its aims in response, and then escalation becomes a self-reinforcing dynamic. And for Trump, you made the observation about an audience of one, which I agree, but rhetorically, unpredictability is part of his brand. He uses it in a lethal way, in some sense, because it's a way of keeping your opponents always guessing. And my sense is that the Iranians are trying to play that same game. So the question, Vali, is if you take all that in, is it possible to even expect that this conflict will not go out of control?
You know, I think you raise excellent points, and you know, to what you said, I'm hoping for the best, as you also laid out some earlier on what could the best case scenario when the war stops. But I'm expecting the worst, largely because Iran is playing a very dangerous game. It's playing with fire, you know, and sometimes you know, expecting sort of prudence, pragmatism on the side of your opponent may be a mistake. You know, there could be also a sort of a mindset here that eventually, you know, sort of Russia with Napoleon, even let him come in, let him give us the best shot. So long as we're standing, we can exact a price. And then that basically puts the ball in Trump's court. At what point does he decide that, yes, they may be willing to go to the next level, but I'm not willing to go to the next level? And, you know, the only example I can think here, I mean, everybody keeps talking about Venezuela, but it's also Yemen. You know, early in his administration, he was sold on the idea, remember the signal gate, we mostly focused on that aspect of it. But in reality, they started a war to destroy the Houthis. And after 2 weeks, he saw that they weren't doing it, and the Houthis were fighting back. And the U.S. was very close to actually having to go to the next level. And so without any fanfare, he pulled the plug. This time it's going to be more difficult for him because this is a much larger war. But my sense is, you know, he thought, if you looked at his State of the Union, you know, he spent less than 2-3 minutes on Iran in a 1 hour, 48-minute speech. It almost was like he was trying to make it a non-issue. And that's where he's actually losing control, more than losing control on the battlefield. In other words, there's a lot more noise among the MAGA that you know, this is not what we were looking for. If price of gas begins to go up, if it hits inflation, if the market numbers, as you just mentioned, keep going down, I think you know, then it's obviously people whose expertise are different than mine, which have to sort of see what is the tipping point domestically for him to basically say that we need to wrap up this war. Rather than what the Iranians are doing. I think Iranians understand that all they need to do is to keep a steady barrage. I mean, let the markets come down, let the price of gas go up, let the global economy take a hit, because Trump had not really thought through these things. And he had not really expected that this may be a long war. And when he says it may take 4 to 5 weeks at this pace, then, you know, who knows where the global economy might be, where the American public might be. I mean, already yesterday there was a poll that said 59% of Americans disapprove of this war. My expectation is that number is going to go higher once middle America begins to actually wake up to this issue. And he has made no preparation of explaining to them what was Iran's urgent threat, why right now, why that threat needs to be dealt with this way. And I think those things could come and bite him. They might, and I think the break point, as you mentioned very aptly, is domestic.
You know, we've been talking about this conflict as a battle of will, but often conflicts really boil down to a battle of logistics. Mm-hmm. So let's explore that a little bit. Obviously, Israel has a very substantial air defense system, which is capable, but is finite. There are reload cycles, production capacity matters, And if, as you pointed out, if the interceptor depletion begins to erode defensive confidence, then political pressure may shift towards more offensive escalation to reduce the incoming volume.
Mm-hmm.
So inventory stress can shift strategy faster than ideology or whatever your strategic objectives are. And in a sustained exchange, logistics may drive outcome more than rhetoric in a way that may not have been anticipated before. And I think you alluded to the fact that in the June war, that was the constraint that stopped the conflict then. So how do you think that plays out? Because in what we've been discussing so far, we've been talking about how there's a negative feedback loop from an escalation point of view, but there's a question of how many interceptors do you have to defend the population?
Exactly. I fully agree with you. I mean, this is also a race between interceptors and missiles. I mean, and again, you're right that war has surprises. In June, Israel was surprised by the fact that Iran not only was able to continue to launch missiles at Israel, aside from what percentage got through or not, and that actually the larger barrages of the missiles came later in the war, towards after the 9th, 10th day, and particularly on the 11th and 12th day. And Israel had been bombing all the launchers they could find or all the entry points into underground silos for missiles, which means that you can't get your missiles out. And it was pretty confident that Iran's missile capability was depleting. But in the end, United States and Israel got nervous that they really didn't know what Iran's missile capability was, and maybe their estimates were wrong. And that's why I think the U.S. pushed for a ceasefire with Iran. Maybe they made a mistake. Maybe Iranians were running out and they didn't need to make a ceasefire or alternative. I mean, right now, Israel's strategy was, first decapitation, then establish an open air corridor between Israel and Iran by bombing whatever air defenses Iran has. I think going essentially after first all of its missile launchers, missile silos, missile capability. And they are putting things out like we've knocked out 2/3 of them. But we really don't know if that is true or not. It may very well be true, which means that Iran will run out of missiles or capability to launch missiles first, or that this may be a miscalculation. And that the Iranians can continue to hit these. Now, with Israel, it's different from the Gulf, because with the Gulf, they don't need to launch missiles from missile launchers. A lot of these are fairly cheap drones that may cost $10,000, $20,000 that requires millions and millions of dollars each time to bring them down, and a fair number are still getting through. So they could keep that up against global energy, et cetera, for a much longer period of time. But this is the real unknown. In other words, in Iran's calculation of this needs to be a longer war, and they need to keep steadily hitting the U.S. rather than look for a knockout punch, try to exhaust it. I don't know if they're really confident they can do it, or have they come up with some way to protect their launchers and be able to evade all of them being destroyed. These are the unknowns of this war.
Let me try to tackle two other questions before we run out of time. Let me take the question of China. So China is obviously not a belligerent here, but is watching very closely. It's Iran's major economic partner. It is a major Gulf energy consumer, and it's a strategic competitor of the United States. So it's watching very closely. I think my view is that they're watching this conflict through three lenses. One, the lens of energy security. Second, the lens of regional stability. And third, strategic competition with the United States. I think they're very carefully studying U.S. execution of this conflict. They're looking at the military's strike integration. They're looking at logistical endurance. They're looking at interceptor usage. And they're looking at domestic political cohesion as this unfolds. And I think all of those elements has implications in terms of their calculus regarding the risk calculus regarding Taiwan, which I think boils down to three multiplicative risks. One is the cost of invasion. Second is the probability of U.S. intervention. And third is the likelihood of sustained U.S. commitment. I'm not suggesting that they plan to do anything with Taiwan. I'm saying if you were sitting at the State Council, these are the elements that you'd be looking for and updating as you see how the Gulf situation unfolds. You'd be updating your assumptions about these elements. How do you think China is looking at this?
I agree with all of your points. I would say that there's also over the horizon the idea that what does Iran's collapse mean for them? So if the United States and Israel were successful and the Islamic Republic were to collapse, first of all, they would lose Iranian oil just like they lost Venezuelan oil. And then they would be highly dependent only on the Arab oil, which is close partners of the United States. And they obviously have always tried to hedge against being over-dependent on the Gulf countries by also buying Venezuelan oil, Russian oil, Iranian oil. So I don't think they welcome that. They also don't welcome sort of Iran as an independent actor in the region closer to them, basically going to the other side. It does change, as you said, certain strategic balance of power with them. They don't welcome the instability in the Gulf. They're worried about disruption to energy supplies, which is happening. But I think they have become reconciled to the fact that this is an existential war for Iran. And so they're not telling Iran, don't do this. They're not weighing in, interestingly, try to dissuade Iran from hitting Saudi or Emirati energy supplies, which is in itself, I think, fairly interesting. And there is some evidence that they perhaps have helped Iran with rebuilding its missile capability since June, that they probably have provided Iran with certain financial support and other intelligence support, electronic support, kinds of things that are much, much more difficult for the United States to identify and point the finger to them if something happens during the war. And similarly with the Russians, they also have tried to help Iran. But there's obviously a limit to how much the Chinese would do, because, as you said, they have equities in the Arab countries as well. And also none of them are going to go to war with the United States over Iran. So there's a limit to what they would do. I think at one level, they are watching U.S. performance in the war. They're also looking at Trump's stamina for a real war, which would be very telling to them. And I think the idea being that if Iran manages to bring down Trump's bravado a notch or two, is not a bad thing for them. I mean, so just like United States getting bogged down in Iraq in 2003 was hugely beneficial to them. The United States is going to become now focused on the Middle East. It's going to be bogged down in the Middle East. That wasn't supposed to be the case. We were supposed to be pivoting to Asia. I mean, from Obama to Trump to Biden, to MAGA movement, that was supposed to be the case. And all of a sudden now, the U.S. Trump is behaving like President Bush, all in the Middle East, changing the regime in Iran, starting a war with no end. China could very well be the beneficiary of that. It may, in the least, find much more room to breathe if U.S.'s strategic interests are elsewhere, and also if truly Trump basically, becomes a little less completely sure in his own leadership, and begins to sort of gets in trouble also at home. maybe a Congress loss in Congress, a much messier American scene for Trump. All of these things are beneficial to them.
Let me end on a discussion about the Iranian diaspora. So obviously what's happening in Iran has particularly hit a nerve and energized the Iranian diaspora, who have watched with horror as the regime has butchered over 30,000 of its own citizens over a 48-hour period in January, which is, I think, by any measure, an unprecedented act of brutality that, at least in my view, totally delegitimizes the regime. In that context, former Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi's name has resurfaced, not as a candidate to restore the monarchy, but as a leader to coalesce the opposition and give people the option to shape their future. His is one of the only names, in fact, maybe the only name that was chanted during the protests on the ground in Iran. The diaspora, as you know, is both furious, but also feels somewhat helpless about what it can constructively do. My own view is that the diaspora matters as a force multiplier, but not a primary engine. It can shape narratives. It can create a moral compass for the world to view what is happening in Iran. It can influence Western governments. But regime change ultimately depends on internal elite fragmentation. And if you don't have an operational base inside of Iran, it's very hard for any opposition leader to influence events. So to some extent, I think the Crown Prince's success depends on the extent to which he has one inside Iran or not. What are your views on that?
I agree with everything you said. I just sort of add just a few things. One is that I think his greatest appeal is not because he's going to oversee transition, it's because he symbolizes monarchy. So, and I think some people are monarchists. Some people actually see monarchy as the only sort of an institution that actually could be a counterpoint to the clergy. And so I think it's actually, that's the reason for his popularity. I agree that he doesn't have a ground game in Iran. Now, I would think the diaspora's convergence with the inside was at its highest point before the war, when the issue was what you were talking about, which is the massacre of January, the oppression, the desire for the Islamic Republic to disappear. But I see a divergence now happening now that the war has happened, and this divergence will expand. You know, particularly the supporters of monarchy are supporters of war. They are supporters and allies with the two countries that are waging the war. This at some point can become problematic because the war would write its own narrative, moral, political, for the Iranians inside. In fact, it might very well fracture the kind of a united anti-regime face that Iran developed after the massacres. Not that people come to love the regime, but there would be a division between those who think that the invasion of the country is wrong, that nationalism for them is more important, even though they may dislike or hate the Islamic Republic. For them, it's protection of the country, versus those who still want the Islamic Republic gone at any cost. And so the diaspora may find itself on the wrong side here. In other words, it might lose its influence inside if the mood in Iran through the war begins to change, become something very different. Because just as the massacres changed political opinion in Iran and changed Iranian society drastically, that experience, a very brutal, bruising war could also have the same kind of an impact. And I think diaspora ultimately will also have to think along the lines that you did, that, you know, sort of imagining a Iran that looks like Turkey or looks like Saudi Arabia, is either democratic, pro-Western, integrated into the region. It's a great vision, but the reality is that you have to work with all the leftovers of what's over there. So they have to be able to connect with a much broader segment of Iranian society, bureaucracy, various elements of the state, if they're going to have an influence on the outcome. Right now, their strategy is not that. It's much more emotional hatred of the Islamic Republic, but hatred is not a political strategy.
Yeah. So, I think we may have different perspectives on this, but my sense is what happened in January was a break in terms of whatever limited compact existed between the people and the regime. And I think most of them would welcome any solution that would take out the regime. But I don't think it remains to be seen to what extent external forces can influence that kind of an outcome. It's very unpredictable, and probably, if you had to probability weight it, the probabilities would probably at this point would suggest that there would be a transition, a regime transition, more than a regime collapse, but one can only hope.
That's right.
Let me try to synthesize this conversation. If we were to step back, it seems to me that there are three layers that are unfolding simultaneously. The first is a tactical layer that is about, missiles, drones, air defenses, and so forth. There's a regional layer that is about Gulf stability, deterrence, credibility, and whether Iran is constrained or destabilized. And then there's a global layer that is about great power signaling, what China learns, how American capacity appears to the world, and whether U.S. strategic bandwidth looks stretched or flexible. I think the paradox is that success in one layer can create risk in another. For example, degrading Iran's capabilities may strengthen short-term deterrence, but harden long-term adversarial doctrine. Or demonstrating U.S. effectiveness, it's possible that it reinforces Taiwan deterrence, but prolonged engagement, as you were suggesting, could drain munitions and focus and undermine domestic political support. So the strategic test is the alignment between the means and the ends. If the objectives remain bounded, stabilization is possible. But if the objectives drift towards transformation without a clear path, then escalation risks multiply. And I think our sense is the weight of those arguments right now favors more the latter than the former. So in any case, I think this is the high-level strategic question before us if we were to expand the aperture on the historic events that are unfolding in the Persian Gulf. And as I started out by saying, it's impossible to predict outcomes. But what we try to do is to frame the optionality surface, and that's all we can hope to do. So thank you so much, Vali, for having this discussion. And thank you all on behalf of Asia Society for listening to this conversation.
Thank you.